At 67, Gary Oldman is celebrated as one of the greatest actors of his generation. But behind the awards, the standing ovations, and the unforgettable performances lies a deeply complicated personal story. For decades, Oldman's life off-screen was marked by intense relationships, 5 marriages, 4 painful divorces, and a long, quiet battle with addiction that slowly shaped many of those breakups. While the world watched him transform into legendary characters, very few knew how much chaos and self-destruction he was facing in real life. In this video, we're uncovering the truth Gary Oldman rarely spoke about: how addiction influenced his love life, why so many marriages fell apart, and what finally pushed him to break his silence after years of regret, reflection, and survival. Gary's first ever widely known romance didn't come under the bright studio lights, but on the stage of London's Royal Court Theatre. There, he met actress Lesley Manville, and their connection felt well-rooted in art and ambition, which led to their marriage in 1987. Soon after the marriage, the couple welcomed their son named Alfie. This is the type of moment that marks the stability of couples. But for them, this became the beginning of a fracture. Just months later, Gary made a life-altering choice that started his scandalous love history. He was drawn by the pull of America and the bright promise of Hollywood. Soon, he left England to chase fame, leaving his wife, Lesley, and their only 3-month-old child on their own. To many, this decision seemed to be driven by destiny rather than devotion. But it also raised a question. He could have brought his family along, but he didn't. Manville rarely spoke publicly about the separation, though years later she offered a restrained but telling reflection, suggesting that the image of perfect fatherhood did not quite match her experience. The marriage ended swiftly, with the divorce finalized in 1990. Yet even before it was legally over, Gary had already begun a new chapter, entering a relationship with Uma Thurman. What remained behind was not scandal, but a lingering sense of loss, an early reminder of how ambition can quietly rewrite personal histories. The beginnings of Gary's relationship with Uma Thurman have long been wrapped in rumor, stitched together from half-remembered timelines and Hollywood whispers. One popular story claims Sean Penn played matchmaker, introducing the two while he and Gary were filming State of Grace in 1989. Another suggests Uma was romantically involved with the film's director when she first crossed paths with Gary on set. For years, no version seemed fully grounded in fact. Then, decades later, clarity finally emerged. In 2014, the director of State of Grace quietly settled the debate, stating that Gary and Uma were already a couple during the filming and married shortly after the project wrapped. However one chooses to interpret it, the overlap is difficult to ignore. Gary's marriage to Lesley Manville had not yet fully ended, and his relationship with Uma was already beginning to take shape. Uma herself later revealed they first met in England when she was just 18, placing their initial encounter sometime in 1988 or early 1989, while Gary was still married and newly a father. That timing inevitably raises uncomfortable questions. Was this connection the unspoken reason he walked away from his wife and infant son? Or was it simply another consequence of a life driven by impulse and ambition? Despite a 12-year age difference, the romance burned quickly and intensely. In 1990, after barely a year together, they married. But the passion that drew them together proved unsustainable. Within 2 years, the marriage collapsed. According to reports, Uma ended it with a blunt letter, one that reportedly made it clear Gary was simply too difficult to live with. The final breaking point came after his arrest for drunk driving, a moment that seemed to crystallize everything she could no longer endure. Later, she reflected with striking honesty, saying it took a very particular kind of woman to live with him. In the end, Uma viewed the marriage not as a great love lost, but as a wild, chaotic chapter, one that burned out exactly as it was destined to. Gary has never been shy about airing his own flaws, often disarming critics by getting there first. In interviews, he once joked about a marriage that barely lasted long enough to register, an offhand remark widely taken as a nod to his brief union with an actress and the shortest chapter of his married life. When asked about the divorce and Uma Thurman's blunt assessment of what it was like to live with him, Gary didn't protest. Instead, he offered a characteristically dry response, suggesting it wasn't exactly bliss on either side. Living together, he implied, was difficult in ways that went far beyond his own shortcomings. "Try living with an angel," he once quipped, adding that the relationship itself may never have carried much weight for either of them. Isabella Rossellini. True to form, he didn't linger long in the aftermath. By 1993, while filming Immortal Beloved, Gary met Isabella Rossellini. The connection was immediate and intense. Within weeks, whispers of marriage began circulating, and by the end of the year they were engaged. But beneath the surface, his personal struggles were deepening. His drinking had reached alarming extremes, including a notorious 70-day binge that left his health visibly deteriorating. Isabella eventually drew a firm line. There would be no future, no wedding, unless he sought help. Faced with the ultimatum, Gary chose rehab and later admitted that getting sober was one of the hardest battles of his life. It was a turning point, but not a saving one for the relationship. The marriage never happened, and by 1996, they went their separate ways. Still, even after heartbreak, addiction, and missed chances, Gary refused to surrender his belief in love. The pattern of hope, collapse, and quiet resolve continued, echoing the restless rhythm that defined both his career and his private life. As his relationship with Isabella Rossellini unraveled, Gary slipped almost seamlessly into what would become his third, and by far most turbulent marriage, this time with photographer Donia Fiorentino. Their story began in an unlikely place, an Alcoholics Anonymous meeting in 1996, where shared vulnerability quickly turned into intense attachment. Within 5 months, they were married, and Donia was pregnant with their first son, Gulliver. 2 years later, their second son, Charlie, was born. From the outside, it may have looked like stability at last, but behind closed doors, the marriage was quietly coming apart. By 2001, Gary was facing his third divorce. The 4-year union collapsed under the weight of addiction, bitterness, and explosive accusations. Donia alleged in court documents that Gary had been physically abusive, claiming he struck her with a phone while she was holding their youngest child. She also accused him of reckless spending on drugs and sex workers. Gary forcefully denied every allegation, countering that Donia's own struggles with addiction made her an unfit parent. The court ultimately sided with him. Custody of their sons was awarded to Gary, a decision that extended even to Donia's daughter from her previous marriage to director David Fincher. Suddenly, the famously intense actor stepped away from Hollywood to raise his children alone. Acting became less about passion and more about survival. He openly admitted that he began choosing roles based on financial necessity rather than creative desire, turning down most offers until the right ones, usually lucrative, floated back. It was during this pragmatic phase that he signed on to major franchises like Harry Potter and The Dark Knight, roles that secured his family's future even as they distanced him from the art he once chased. Years later, amid the rise of the Me Too movement, Danya spoke out again, expressing deep resentment and loss. She said she felt her children had been taken from her and her life irreparably damaged, claiming she was gradually shut out of their world altogether. By then, the emotional divide was permanent. Romance was no longer a priority for Gary. He avoided serious relationships for years, determined to focus on his sons. Still, solitude never lasted forever. In 2008, he married again, this time to Alexandra Edinburgh, a gifted musician more than 2 decades his junior. Aware of his own history, Gary admitted he wasn't proud of reaching a 4th marriage, but he hoped, sincerely, that this one would be his last. That hope didn't survive. Alexandra filed for divorce in 2015, with Gary later pointing to their age difference as the quiet fracture between them. Even then, approaching 60, weathered by heartbreak and hard-earned wisdom, Gary Oldman remained stubbornly open to love, still searching, still believing, as if reinvention were not just a career skill, but a personal necessity. 5th marriage. Just 2 years after the collapse of his 4th marriage, Gary quietly stepped into a very different chapter. He married writer Giselle Schmidt in an understated ceremony held at the home of his longtime manager, Douglas Urbanski. There were no grand headlines or red carpet theatrics, only the calm certainty that came after years of conversation, patience, and reflection. When Gary finally decided to ask the question, he did it in a way only he could. At the time, he was deep into filming Darkest Hour, fully immersed in the role of Winston Churchill. During a brief pause in shooting, he followed an impulse that felt strangely right. In the depths of the recreated war rooms, he led Giselle into the map room and, still in character, asked her to marry him, not as Gary Oldman, but as Britain's legendary wartime leader. She said yes. The moment, however, barely had time to breathe before the crew called him back to set, cutting the romance short with professional urgency. Later, Giselle found humor in the surreal timing. Gary would recall her joking that she went to bed with Winston Churchill and woke up next to Gary Oldman, a line that perfectly captured the strange blend of history, performance, and real life that defined their beginning. Unlike his previous relationships, much of Giselle's life has remained deliberately private. She had been married for 2 decades before, had a son named William, and brought with her a sense of stability rather than spectacle. What stood out most was the absence of bitterness. Gary has spoken warmly about her former husband, describing him as a good man who attended their wedding. The families blended with ease, without rivalry or resentment, something rare in a life once marked by chaos. Together with their children, they built a home in Los Angeles, far from the noise Gary once seemed drawn to. He now avoids red carpets, rarely appears at parties, and has largely stepped away from the public rituals of fame. Marriage number 5 feels different, even to him. Gary has reflected that men often don't truly understand themselves until later in life, and that love found after 40 asks for something else entirely. Not intensity or escape, but openness and acceptance. This relationship, he suggests, is less about being consumed and more about being present. After decades of restless searching, broken promises, and self-inflicted wounds, it seems he may have finally arrived at a quieter truth. Perhaps his darkest hours, both on screen and off, are now firmly in the past. Despite all the addiction and controversial love life, Gary's career was far from just an actor. Gary Oldman's career is less a straight line than a gallery of transformations. Few actors have disappeared into their roles as completely, often leaving audiences shocked to learn the same man was behind wildly different performances. From the beginning, Oldman resisted being typecast, choosing complexity over comfort. He first exploded onto the global stage as Sid Vicious in Sid and Nancy, a raw, chaotic performance that captured both punk rebellion and self-destruction. That intensity followed him into the 1990s, when he became Hollywood's go-to actor for dark, volatile figures. His chilling turn as the corrupt cop Norman Stansfield in Leon, The Professional, remains one of cinema's most unsettling villains. Unpredictable, theatrical, and terrifyingly human. Yet Oldman was never confined to menace. He stunned audiences as Count Dracula in Bram Stoker's Dracula, bringing tragic romance and vulnerability to a character often played as pure horror. Around the same time, he proved his range again in True Romance and The Fifth Element, where his flamboyant antagonist felt almost unrecognizable compared to his earlier work. In the 2000s, Oldman quietly entered a new phase, less explosive, more authoritative. As Sirius Black in the Harry Potter series, he became a symbol of damaged loyalty and lost innocence, earning the affection of a new generation. Soon after, Christopher Nolan cast him as Commissioner James Gordon in the Dark Knight trilogy, where Oldman anchored the films with moral weight, restraint, and weary integrity. Perhaps his most transformative role came later in life. In Darkest Hour, Oldman vanished entirely beneath makeup and mannerisms to portray Winston Churchill. What could have been a caricature became deeply human, stubborn, frightened, inspiring. The performance finally earned him the Academy Award many felt was decades overdue. Beyond these highlights, his work in films like Tinker Tailor Soldier Spy, Immortal Beloved, and The Book of Eli shows an actor drawn to contradiction and depth rather than vanity. Gary Oldman's legacy isn't built on one iconic role, but on reinvention itself, a career defined by risk, reinvention, and the rare courage to never repeat himself.